So I think we'll get started. My name is Anna Grzymowska. I'm the director of the Europe Center. Just before we get started, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, and Mark and I'll transmit them to Mark so he can answer them. And having said that, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Mark Blyth, who is the professor of international economy in the Department of Political Science at Brown University. He's a brilliant scholar whose work crosses several disciplines, including economics, political science, complexity theory, evolutionary theory, and sociology. He's the author of several books, including the award-winning Austerity and now Angrynomics, which combine economic analysis with keen insights about the politics of policymaking and the ways in which ideas and cognitive bias about the nature of economic problems generate the pathologies of policy. On a different note, he's also one of the funniest people in the social sciences. I first met him at a conference where there was a group of people laughing uproariously, laughing so hard that one of us fell off an ottoman. And it was all thanks to Mark, who was holding court and telling a joke about, of all things, central banks. So it is with great pleasure that we welcome Mark Blyth today to talk about his latest book, Angrynomics. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to talk to you all today. And thank you for reminding everyone that the bar for making social scientists laugh is incredibly low. But with that in mind, maybe we'll have a few giggles as we go through this, if only in that sense of exhaustion and irony, which accompanies so much of our observations about the world in the current moment. So with that, I'm going to start sharing a screen and start sharing some slides. I believe I'm going to present for about 25, something like that, 30 minutes. And then after that, we'll go to Q&A. One thing I will say up front is that Eric, my co-author, and I, he's Irish, I'm Scottish, and most of the examples in the book are from the United States, where I live, and from the UK, where he lives. And of course, neither of those things are parts of Europe. Given that this is a Centre for Europe talk, I think what might be really fun in the Q&A is if we, rather than you say to me, what about this? We have a kind of more general discussion about whether this actually works for Europe, right? What would this say about Germany? What would this say about Hungary? What would this say about Sweden, right? So that could be an interesting thing to pull on as we get there. So with that in mind, let's start sharing the screen. And here we go. As you can see, you can judge a book by a cover because it's an excellent cover. So we don't actually have a working definition in the book. This book is not an academic book in the sense it's filled with endless footnotes and data tables and analyses, etc. It's actually a book for ordinary people. That is the informed public. So it's also written in a dialogue, which is rather unusual. Our ideal customer was basically your angry uncle from Thanksgiving who thinks he understands everything. As he's flying home and you can't wait to get rid of him, give him this for the 3-hour plane ride on the way home. So what is Angrynomics? Well, one definition that we like is the effect generated when most people in a country no longer believe that the economy benefits them. Now, an example of this is this little infographic from the UK that someone sent me, which I thought was kind of brilliant. So if you have a look on the left, what you see there in 1970 is the average salary, and then inflation adjusted on the right, you see 23,000 versus 22,000. So in other words, you have the cost structures of the 2020s facing people who have no assets, who are not young enough or have grown up in an environment which is harder to form assets, and yet you have the salary of the 1970s. If you have a look at house prices, again, what you see there is 3.4 times the average salary, now 9.7 times the average salary. The unemployment rate after 30 years of reforms and moving in a pro-market direction, which was meant to make us all richer, is now doubled what it was back in the 1970s. And of course, we invented this wonderful thing called student debt, which in a world of negative longs, where governments of the OECD can borrow negatively at a negative real rate for over 30 years, somehow we're managing to get students to pay 6.1% interest. So I thought it'd be fun to basically redo this for the United States. So I did, and this is what it looks like. If you inflation adjust all these figures, basically a bachelor's degree in 1970 got you 58,000 and now gets you 65,000. So it's slightly better, but that's a 10% real increase over 50 years. The average house price has gone from 156 to 264. But the thing is, college grads do not move to places like Ohio where you stay relatively stable prices. or houses for 264. You get apartments in Boston, which are 653. So again, work out the multiplier on that relative to the income. Unemployment's always been high. It's got a little bit higher. And the interesting thing is that British student loans seem to be higher than American ones on average. I was really surprised to see this. But nonetheless, it's a 54% real increase in 27 years. And you still have that fundamental problem. If you're trying to deal with the cost structures and stresses of the 2020s with the income of the 1970s. And if you want to see the sort of the summary of this, the summary statistic on this, this is the average hourly wage of blue collar workers divided by the consumer price index for the United States. Basically, we're not even being paid as well as we were in 1980 or even in 1973, if you're in the bottom 60% of the US income distribution. I think that basically is enough to get people angry. And this is true everywhere. This is true in Chile. This is true in the United Kingdom. This is true even in richer countries like Sweden, which have seen an acceleration in inequality and a denigration of their social safety nets. And we wanted to make a case that this phenomenon of being angry about the economy and anger being generated by the economy is a good place to start. So the two faces of anger that we talk about in the book are, one is moral outrage and weaponized energy. So on the top, you see the Black Lives Matter protests. Cornel West did a CNN interview when these events started unfolding in the summer, which really summed up exactly what we were getting at when he said, if you are not outraged about the events that are driving these protests, then what does that say about our country? And it's that idea that a wrong, a moral wrong, needs to be redressed that drives that collective action, that collective anger. What we see downstairs, of course, is the March upon the Capitol from January 6th, a very different type, not based on a moral outrage in the sense that a morality that is either right or wrong that we can agree with, but people who feel that they have a set of moral claims to make. The election was stolen, etc., etc. But this is the one that is weaponized in politics to produce political ends. And also the latter is really a form of kind of in-group regulation of norms, identifying who is us versus them as a political move, as opposed to a more inclusive move to basically identify the external wrong as a kind of general claim to moral outrage. What we also talk about in the book then is shame, self-harm, and alienation, the micro side of anger. And what we'll talk about in particular, and I'll say more in a moment, is about how the stresses of labor markets and product market deregulations over the past 30 years have really added to, if you will, the micro stressors, which compound these macro angers. One way to think about it is public anger is information. Anger is a moral outrage and a desire to be heard. It is a reaction to the feeling that no one cares, the idea of being in places that no longer matter, the left behind, etc. Anger is a reaction to off-limit areas of concern, the inability to raise certain topics, the idea that certain concerns are inherently prejudiced. And we find the full manifestation of this in the failure of representative institutions and political parties. This is not a new thing. Failure in these, faith in these institutions has been declining for a period of 20 years or more in most places, and particularly in the transformation of political parties in this kind of populist moment, where if we look at the European cases, depending on how you count it, half the party systems of Europe have been completely transformed over the course of a decade. What do we also see? The rise of an anti-immigration politics. Again, that's that weaponizing anger of in-groups and out-groups. And then again, what we want to tie this to is the collapse of real wage growth and increasing inequality as the kind of micro and macro driver to this story. The micro stressors I mentioned earlier, just to flesh this out, private anger is the micro stressors that amplify this public anger. Jacob Hacker has written extensively about this, as have many other people by this point, the risk shift from firms and governments to individuals without basically giving individuals compensatory mechanisms to absorb those risks. The rise that we've seen documented in mental illnesses, epidemiological inequality. If we think about the work of epidemiologists who did, for example, the spirit level and the very robust correlations you get between rising levels of inequality and a whole host of public bads, everything from obesity to mental illness to recidivism in prisoners. The stress from market deregulation, the increase in platforming, digital platforming, piecework, digital piecework, zero-hour contracts, franchising, all of which puts the stress on labor and makes the extraction of surplus from labor much more of the dominant business model. And the big one that's coming along, of course, or we keep hearing about at least, and in Stanford, I'm sure you hear a lot of it in particular, this kind of existential threat of replacement. The robots are coming for your jobs, and on redundancy, that is to say aging, because we're all aging societies. So I know political scientists in particular like 2x2s. We don't have this in the book, but I thought he put it here anyway. So if you want to do a map of angrynomics, it would look like this: public and private anger on the top, moral outrage, a series of claims to be listened to. The claim we make and try and flesh out in the rest of the book is that macroeconomic crashes generate these episodes of moral outrage, that private anger is the micro stressors that come along in their wake, that tribal energy, weaponizing anger for instrumental ends in politics, is also got macroeconomic sources, but that is produced by a different set of political mechanisms we can talk about. And then finally, private anger comes together with tribal energy. When we started writing the book, we didn't really have anything to put in that box. But over time, unfortunately, it began to fill up with likely candidates. Boogaloo movements, the QAnon mass resistance. You could add capital rioters into that, where you get civil unrest and fragmentation on a micro level, complementing the sort of the macroeconomic fragility that we see in our institutions. So with that in mind, I'm going to walk through macro angrynomics and then micro angrynomics. So what's the idea here? I started giving talks at tech conferences because I got really interested around 2014 in this notion that the robots are coming for our jobs. I was incredibly skeptical of this claim, and I thought I'm going to do some research on this. So of course you go talk to academics, basically either it's like, yes, everything's going to be taken away, or no, it's not going to happen. So I thought I'd go talk to tech people. And the only way I could get into tech conferences is if I went to talk to them. And it turned out they wanted to know what the hell was going on in kind of the economy and in politics. So there was a nice gains in trade that we could make. So I developed a way of talking to tech people about the economy using an analogy of capitalism as computers. So if you bear with me for a minute, I'll just unpack this a bit because it's how we frame this part of the book. Any capitalist economy can be thought of as capitalist hardware. Just as computers have motherboards and CPUs and accelerator chips and video graphics chips, their precise configuration varies by model. And if you will, the instructions that make that work, the software that makes it run, has an analog in the economic ideas of a period. That certain types of market institutions run well with certain types of software. However, over time, when you basically run software for a long time on a changing set of institutions, a changing configuration of hardware, you get bugs in the software. And those bugs in the software build up over time and eventually crash the system. So this is how I explain first to tech people and then to normal people how this works. So if we think of capitalism 1.0, the era of the gold standard, that was Karl Polanyi, emblematic of the bug in the software that we're going to talk about there. What were the type of hardware that made that work? Well, you had open markets, free flows of commodities, people and money, and the classic limited liberal state, to which you could also add the gold standard itself. What was the software? Well, the software that went along with this was classical economics, the idea of laissez-faire, do not interfere in markets, let them adjust, and the doctrine of sound money, that it must be tied to gold, etc., etc. What were the bugs in the software? Well, this is what Polanyi warned us about. The idea that labor is a commodity, just like any other commodity, is a fiction. And if you build a set of hardware and software institutions whose main mechanism of adjustment in the system is to push down on wages at a micro level through the trade balance, and if you have a macro set of institutions that basically gives everyone an incentive to become an exporter rather than an importer, because that's how you keep your gold, then you get a deflation in the system, which is guaranteed to both bring collective action to labor and also to really annoy them, because their wages are either highly volatile or going down, hence the Second International and everything that followed from that. And because labor is not a commodity, where did the system crash? In World War I, in the nationalism of the period, and then following in the Great Depression. So 30 years later, you try and build a new computer. What does the new computer look like? The Keynesian order. Well, the hardware is very different. Much more national economies, capital controls to keep finance and investment at home so that you can run high taxes and transfers all behind a full employment target. This is Le Trente Glorieuses. This is the Wirtschaftswunder. This is what the Italians beautifully called Il Boom, the 30 glorious years of growth and fun. The software, of course, was Keynesian macro stabilization ideas, but this time the bug in the software, as predicted by Koletsky back in 43, was inflation and a profit squeeze. Eventually, you can only run the system with a full employment target and run it hot to the extent that productivity can pay for wage increases. Eventually, you will outpace that, and then you will generate inflation, which will hit profits. Capital will defect and demand a return to sound money. Guess what? That's pretty much what happened in the big crash of the 1970s, stagflation. So what's the system reset? Capitalism 3.0, the neoliberal order. The hardware modification of the time was absolutely critical, was independent central banks with operational independence and an inflation target. Along with that, you free up capital flows, privatize, liberalize, globalize, and what you do is you eventually, over time, build a system in which it's almost impossible to generate wage inflation. The software to do this is, of course, neoclassical economics, and the bugs in the software, which we're beginning to see now, and what we think are causing much of this disruption, is, as I've mentioned, wage stagnation, but also asset bubbles, and then clearing them up when they explode, because the clear up is highly asymmetric to those that have assets. They're the ones that get the protection. A crisis in bank leverage, which was brutally exposed in 2008 and caused in some cases a lost decade of growth for Europe, and increases in inequality across the whole system. The real big system crash was 2008 with the global financial crisis, but the problem was this time around, there was no reset. There was no rebuild. Basically, we turned to the central banks and told them to go against what they were meant to do. Never mind price stability, please cause massive price instability. Rather than actually allowing assets to find their market value, we wanted to distort the hell out of them through QE so that we can add liquidity and bail out the system. None of the underlying bugs are addressed. The software is effectively patched. The hardware is still the same. Austerity, particularly in Europe, made things a lot worse. And the result was economics, as we knew it, became Angrynomics. So what's the micro side of this? We talk about capitalism as a stress machine. So version 3.0 is still here and is still very stress-filled. What are the hardware modifications of the past 30 years that have made our stress levels go up? Well, the first one is deunionization and labor market liberalization. Why? Because that's directly the mechanisms that impinge on inequality and precarious work contracts, contingent contracts, and benefit cuts, which we see affecting primarily the bottom 60% of the income distribution, but it is moving through the scale. This is beginning to affect everyone. Product market liberalization. We don't often think about this one, but the genie of profits is actually bigger than the genie of inequality in wages. And that's really telling, because what it means is you end up with, as we see increasingly, an economy where very few firms that employ very few people make most of the profits. Critical suppliers to those firms still make reasonable profits and pay decent wages, and everyone else is on the equivalent of a McDonald's franchise. The work of Mark Herman Schwartz, a political economist in Virginia, is really brilliant on this topic, as is the book by Brett Christopher's Rentier Capitalism, which just came out last year. So margins get squeezed, wages stagnate, profit dispersal widens. What else? Financial market liberalization. Why is that a stressor? Because of credit bubbles and the massive build-up in private debt that we've seen, which continues to impinge upon consumption. Interestingly, it does so across generations, because if you look at the way that assets are distributed in the United States, which is the most extreme case, basically baby boomers have 80% of all the assets. But the really interesting thing is 80% of that 80% own, 20% of those boomers own 80% of everything. And 20% of that 20% own 64% of everything. So there's this tiny bunch of old people that have all the cash. Now, if you think about increasing inequality, precarious work, who actually ends up doing this? It's younger people. And they also have higher student debt, and they also live in lower growth economies, and they're not getting wage increases. So their chance of forming assets over the life cycle is becoming much curtailed, all of which is highly stressful. And then finally, the globalization of production. Why? Because this enabled on a macro level the capital share to massively increase. And those pressures in the wage share that we see already are compounded by these effects. So two important stresses we talk about in the book, one robots and the other one aging. I'm just going to mention in closing now why aging is important, because we all hear about robots all the time, but we don't hear a lot about aging. Why aging societies are stress generators, but not for the old. And I've alluded to this already. Here we go. But I should have saved that because I forgot I was going to talk about this in this slide, but there you go. Boomers vote more, twice as much as millennials, and the top 20% of 80% of all financial assets. The top 20% of that top 20% have 64% of everything. The young have debt but no assets, which impacts fertility and asset formation. That politicizes immigration, because that would be your solution, right? They're not forming assets, they're not having enough kids, the denominator of the economy is shrinking, the debt stock is getting bigger, growth is falling. What should you do? Immigration. But the problem is you can't. Why? Because we've weaponized that in our politics, primarily with the votes of older people. An old society cannot generate consumption growth. It is impossible. They've bought all the fridges they're ever going to buy, so investment falls. And also, boomers are far more likely to deny global warming. So if you treat this as a kind of intergenerational problem rather than a class problem, or a class problem compounded by a generational component, you can see why basically aging in and of itself has these kind of angrynomic consequences. So how do we calm the anger? Что делается, as Lenin once said. What is to be done? And the analogy I like to use now is moving the furniture around. If you have a bunch of angry people coming around to your house for dinner and you set things up with a big long table with everyone facing each other, Game of Thrones style, it's not going to go very well. If, on the other hand, you get some mood lighting, a bar, some beanbags, you change the possibility set, right? So what would be the furniture in the room we'd like to see? So we talk about four things, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. First one is, how do you deal with the increasing intergenerational inequality problem? Well, we talk about a citizens' wealth fund financed by financial crashes. This is something that's actually getting a little bit of uptake. Some governments are actually interested in this. The basic idea is that in a financial crisis, which happens all the time now, every 10 years at least, equities fall by 50% in value. Usually the central bank steps in and one way or another puts a floor under prices, and then those equity holders are kept whole. Why do we do this? Why don't we just buy the equities, put them in a passive fund, and then let the equity premium, 6% a year, compound over time, and then give that out as dividends to the citizens, the taxpayers that actually paid for the bailout? You could do a huge dent in intergenerational equality over a 10-year period with this. Second one, building common assets. We used to have public assets. We privatized them all. Turned out that wasn't such a great idea. One way to rebuild this, instead of taxing companies like Google and Amazon, is to recognize that every time that we use a keyboard on one of their platforms, we're providing them with a property right. That property right is our data. We should actually license our data rather than giving it away for free, rather than trying to tax them on the back end, and use that if you want, if you're into this sort of thing, as a UBI, Universal Basic Income seed, or as more funds for a citizens' wealth fund. Foolproofing recessions. COVID has actually been quite amazing in the sense that two of the things we say in the book you should do are actually being done. The first one is direct monetary transfers. Turns out that we're doing this. What we need to do is to get serious with this and do this through central bank digital currencies and do it on an automatic basis as recession fighting. There's no reason to do this, not to do this. It's actually cheaper and more efficient than the alternatives. And the second one, dual interest rates, which the ECB is actually doing now, which is really rocket fuel for investment if you pursue it to the full extent, which they haven't done yet, although Philip Lane, the chief economist at the ECB, is, he put it this way, he well knows the power of the weapon he has in his hands. Okay, now once you do that, I say you can try the hard stuff, and this is where I'll finish up. And this is the last slide, and I want you to have a look at this closely. The biggest problem that we face is not populism of the moment. The biggest problem that we face is extinction. And I think we all really are coming to recognize this, denial us apart. Even leading firms in the mining sector and the energy sector have accepted this and are actually trying to think their way through of how do they get to the other side of this transition. Well, the problem with the transition is really not economics, it's politics. And here's why we need to calm the anger, otherwise you won't get from A to B. A is the left-hand panel, which is the 2020 electoral map. If you have a look at that, you see that sea of red? Right, that's the Republican states. Now look on the other side. This is a carbon tax possibility map. Opportunity for carbon taxes at the state level. And all of those red states are remarkably similar. Why? Because all of those states have carbon at the heart of their economies in one way, shape, or form. It's extraction, it's manufacture, it's distillation, whether it's in plastics, whether it's in petrochemicals, whether it's in forms of gas. they are all, whether it's in fertilizer and farming, they are all part of the carbon economy. What is it the Democrats do? Where do the Democrats live? They live in the post-carbon economy. They need electricity, but they don't really particularly want them from carbon. In fact, they want all the carbon to stay in the ground. We are so angry with each other in this moment that we risk screwing up this transition. And the way that you don't screw up this transition is to really work on those underlying economic factors that are making people angry, so that you can effectively turn that slide around and then effectively turn those red states not into blue states, but into part of the post-carbon coalition. So I think that's ultimately what's at stake with this, and I'll be happy to talk about anything you want from there. So there we go. Half an hour, bang on.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Before we start, I'm going to take my prerogative as chair and ask you to talk about Europe, right? Because there we see higher levels of income equality, we see higher levels of union membership, but you still see a lot of the same anger, especially when it comes to immigration. So if you wouldn't mind, sort of, how does this apply to the EU?
Sure. Actually, I think, I mean, there's lots of work has been done on this now, but the seed of it was work that was actually done by the Commission. So Marco Butti and his team at the Commission did some really interesting work on this when the AfD showed up in Germany. And what they found is something that we find everywhere now, which is that people in the game call it, it's all in the delta. It's not in the absolute value, it's in the rate of change. So if you came from an area which is really well off and has great social supports, but it's kind of been on the slide for a while, right? That 90th percentile produces the same sort of dynamics as if you started at the 30th percentile and went to the 20th. So it's not the fact that you were once, you know, you're rich versus poor. It's the fact that there's a general feeling of decline. The other big correlate of this is outmigration of the young. So if you have lots of old people who are in areas that have been on the slide for a while, and you add in a third one, there's a great paper out from the LSE on this, which is called Golfing with Trump, which is kind of riffing off Sherry Berman's old paper, Bowling with Hitler, right? And what they point out is exactly those communities, old but on the slide, that have high levels of social capital is where you get a right-wing response. Because what you get is a kind of us versus them mentality against outsiders, which is amplified through these local social networks and local social institutions, which then is really weaponizable in politics. So I think that's how one would, you know, look at it that way. Yes, in terms of, you know, Sweden is my favorite example on this one. Of course, you know, everyone's favorite welfare state, high levels of social protection, etc. But two things, if you look at the numbers, Swedish inequality over the past decade has gotten really, really bad in comparison to what it was. Secondly, they've changed the service delivery component and also the criteria for the administration and access to many of their social programs. It's become much, much more Anglo in that sense. And at the same time, as the economy has changed and moved away from manufacturing exports to service exports, that kind of polarization between the big cities and the knowledge economy hubs versus the rest of the country is there too. So I think if you look the story of sort of, you know, Europe has all this and America doesn't, and therefore it doesn't work. No, it's all in the delta. It's all in the rate of change.
So relative losses rather than absolute ones. So we have several questions here. Why don't I try and transmit some of these? One of these is sort of asks you to think more broadly about reparations, socialized services, voucher pest UBI, and how those might fit into some of the solutions.
All right, there's a last one. I'm just looking at these as well, so we're looking at the same.
Okay, great.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, I think they would. I mean, reparations is a fascinating case of this, right? So the usual retort against this type of argument is that, well, it's culture, right? I mean, people are basically angry about cultural things. They don't give a crap about economics. It's all culture. Now, reparations is a very interesting one here, and I'll give you an example. In 2017, the Boston Federal Reserve published a report on the net family wealth of Boston families. And here's the numbers. Because Boston is a very small place with a bunch of super rich people, there's a very long tail, which means when you calculate that average, it goes up, right? It's much higher than it otherwise would be. And the number they came up with was $247,000. So if you're honestly telling me that basically, you know, South Boston families are sitting there on $250,000, I just don't believe it. But that's the way the numbers go. They did the same for Black families. The figure's $8. Now, the only way that you generate that degree of inequality and sustain it over time is the systematic exclusion of a population, which from economic growth, which is what we have seen, whether it was the failure of Reconstruction and the imposition of Jim Crow, whether it was the exclusion from the New Deal, whether it was the exclusion from the union growth of the 50s and 60s, belatedly taking part in that in the 1970s, only to be hit by the twin forces of white flight and deindustrialization, then the war on drugs, which is an essentially deeply racist campaign, and then mass incarceration. So to me, there's an overwhelming case for reparations on that basis, but guess what? It's an economic case. If you just argue that as a cultural case, then I think the case for it is much, much weaker.
Do you want me to take the questions, or would you prefer?
No, you pick.
Okay, great. So there's another great question here about, so would relieving the economic stressors actually help to relieve the anger, right? Is that enough?
So that is the $64,000 question, and I'm hopeful, and here's why. If you go the other way and say that this won't be enough and you don't do anything about it, you're implicitly making a counterfactual argument that we can tolerate obscene and absurd levels of stress and inequality in our income because ultimately it kind of doesn't matter, right? I think that's the counterfactual that falls on it, and that clearly is deeply problematic. The second one is, if you write all this up as a kind of culture camp, right, if this is just a big sort of cultural stramash between racists and others, then there is no effective public policy solution to that. There is none. It is literally a council of despair. So what is it that we need to, what can we do? The nice thing about economics is you can at least try. And we have a counterfactual, and the counterfactual goes like this. If you go back to the last period of real sustained wage growth, real wage growth for the bottom 60%, it was between 1995 and 2001. There was none of this stuff going on then. If you go back to the period before that, was 87 to 92, that you don't get these parties, you don't get these concerns, they're just not there when you have sustained real wage growth. And if you have created a world whereby you have the cost structures of the 2020s and the wages of the 1970s, that's not a sustainable mix. We can do something about that if we choose to. I worry that if we take another interpretation on that, or if we don't try, or if we don't think it's going to be enough and we don't try, then in a sense, the alternative is an even worse alternative.
That's still very much an economist's approach, right? And one of the question asks, so, given we have a new president in this country, what would you recommend that president actually do? What's the feasible set of policies, and what should, for example, President Biden be doing to address Angrynomics?
So some of the stuff that he's actually proposing is going some way to doing this. But the key thing is wage growth. And a minimum wage is great at $15, but essentially in order to do this, you have to reduce the capital share. You basically have to tax corporations. We stopped taxing corporations. Forget the headline numbers about, the tax rate is now, 15% or whatever, right? Look at Zuckman's estimates. I mean, the real effective rate outside of tax havens is about 6%, if I remember correct. Inside tax havens, it's 2% or less. We have examples from Europe with the Apple tax case in Ireland, and then the double Dutch treatment of Irish taxes, which meant that, again, it was one of the large digital companies, was paying about 0.5% real taxes. So we've created and this is incredibly fragilizing for the economy. You think about it. If the biggest, most impressive firms we got are nothing but tax scams, what does that actually say about the underlying strength of the economy? Why are we permitting this? Right? Shouldn't they be producing real value? And I think that's where, if he really wants to press and make a difference, it's there. It's got to be at the point of production of wealth rather than simply on the redistribution of wealth. The other thing I'll say, just very briefly, one thing on this, the other thing he can start doing is do something that we've become really bad at over the past 25 years, which is particularly on the center left and the people that go to universities like Brown and Stanford, etc. We need to actually respect our fellow citizens rather than thinking them of as social problems to be managed. Right? That we actually, when we say we're in this together, it's actually meant to mean something rather than just something we say before we live entirely different lives. So something has to be done on that level. A politics of recognition of a different type would go a long way.
So you mentioned Zuckerberg, and there's a question here about social media platforms and the ways in which they can weaponize and vector basically Angrynomics and other sentiment.
Yes, hi Anat. Lovely. Good to know you're on the call. What is there a lesson for them? And yeah, I mean, they're absolutely culpable. I mean, if you think about kicking Trump off Twitter in the aftermath of the 6th of January, that was entirely about damage limitation. This is essentially, you know, it's Voltaire that has a line that says, "Those who peddle falsehoods will invite you to atrocity," or something like this. And they just didn't want to be blamed for the atrocity. So in a sense, they're not even in control of the consequences of their own business model. And I think that what they've done is they've got to a point where they realize this. And there's a space to be discovered by both sides, by both those who would regulate and those who will be regulated, that we need to find that space and make it work. Nobody wants to destroy these technologies, but the weaponization of myth and the way that the algorithm can basically turn you into a QAnon freak within 3 weeks, that has to stop. It's utterly destructive to democratic values and democratic processes. So I think that they increasingly know this. Zuckerberg may be the block on this personally, but I think Twitter's accepted this. Google's running to the hills in terms of risk liability on this stuff. So we'll see where it goes. But it has to be done.
Right. So speaking of other contributors to Angrynomics, there's a question here about public education and the ways in which it's, you know, lower investment in public education contributes to the issues that we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the great sort of leveling up, if you want to use that Boris Johnson language, I don't usually, but I'll use it in this instance, is been the collapse of public universities. So essentially, tax cut after tax cut at the state level is paid for by increase in fees and tuition, increase in fees and tuition. That is paid for by greater access to expensive student debt. And then when you don't have real wage growth, you just end up with an enormous debt burden and a student loan crisis. If you basically refund education at that level and also below that at the actual high school level and reorganize it and perhaps give it a sort of, I would say, almost a more French type of, if not, nobody's going to go for central control here, but some kind of sense of purpose as to what it's about, then yeah, that would go a long way. But to me, really the issue here as someone who works in a university environment is less at the high school level. The United States actually spends comparatively well, particularly in some states at the public school level. It's at the level of the public universities where the real work needs to be done.
So speaking of sort of, you know, people at the other end of their lives, there's a question here about pension systems and the ways in which they may contribute to either wealth redistribution or greater inequality, and how both private and public pension systems may have something to do with the rise of Angrynomics.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I mean, if you were lucky enough to basically take out your 401k in 1983 and you went long financial assets, I mean, you'd be doing great. I won't mention this person by name, but there's a sociologist I know who works at a university, you know this person as well, who once said to me at a conference, you know what the ultimate embarrassment is? I can't believe how rich I am, and yet I'm a professor. So there's a way in which this has become compounded in the right place at the right time, right? With the right type of weaponized financial assets. Absolutely, you can make a killing. The public sector problem on this one is real. There is a real sort of, I mean, you can get into whether states can really be insolvent or not in their own currency, and I don't want to go there just now. But to the extent that, you know, public pensions have become a drain, yeah, absolutely. Look no further than Italy. Right? I mean, it's just an incredible part of the problem of cleaning up their, you know, their fiscal mess. And what do? You know, a little bit of anecdata on this. Again, someone we know who's a political scientist in London. His wife's mother had 2 pensions and existed on those 2 pensions longer than she ever worked in a country that has negative population growth. Yeah, like that needs to be dealt with. Is it contributing directly to the anger? I don't think directly, but I think that indirectly it's definitely contributing to, if you will, kind of financial stress in general.
What about the broader worry about public debt, right? And how many of the proposals you suggest would exacerbate public debt, at least in the short term?
Yeah, I totally don't worry about public debt. I wrote the book on austerity being a dangerous idea. I think it's a canard. The evidence just now is very straightforward. Even the IMF ex-chief economist, Olivier Blanchard, basically wrote a paper last year saying, don't sweat the debt. Because for 4 out of 5 periods, the rate of growth in the economy has been higher than the rate of growth in the debt stock. Add to this the fact that real interest rates have been plummeting by some estimates, if you exclude the 70s and 80s, since the 1300s, right? We are where we're meant to be in terms of structurally low rates. We've run 2 giant experiments on the quantity theory of money and inflation at a worldwide level, bailing out the financial crisis, now bailing out COVID. There should be hyperinflation everywhere. There's none, right? So the only relevant question about debt sustainability is, do people want to buy the bonds? Yes, the auctions never fail. There's a shortage of safe assets. Do they want to buy them a lot? Yes, you can sell them at a negative real rate. Is that sustainable over a long term? Yes, because you can lock in those financing rates for 20 years, and it's crazy that we're not doing it. So I don't worry about that. I worry about private debt. I think the buildup of private debt is a problem because people can go bankrupt. And they do go bankrupt. Firms can and do go bankrupt. And if you look at the way that corporate debt issuance has just been absolutely weaponized in the COVID crisis by the Fed and its policies, I worry about that far more than I worry about public debt.
So that brings me to another question, which is about sort of the fiscal effects of COVID, or the actually monetary and fiscal, and it asks about the massive inflation that it might come with all the injection of the COVID stimulus funding.
Yeah, I saw Jeremy Siegel's piece in the FT about that yesterday, and it's amazing. It's just like people who were trained in the 70s just cannot not see inflation. I mean, literally, we have been running a 12-year-long experiment trying to generate it. And Japan has been running a 30-year experiment trying to generate it, and it doesn't work, and we're still looking for it. But just on a simple basis, why is it not happening? Because all the money that's making it from the banking system out into the world is going to 2 groups. It's going to the top 20%, who are people like us who can work from home, who've got good salaries, a whole lot. We're just saving it, right? We're not going to go on a huge splurge because of this. All this, our propensity, to use the old-fashioned language, our propensity to consume is pretty damn small, right? So when you've got the NPC with all the people with the money, and it's small and in some cases negative, that's not going to do a lot. Then you go to the bottom end of the income distribution, right? You're talking about, without relief, possibly up to 30 million Americans who are facing eviction from homes. You're talking about 55 million Americans using food banks on a regular basis. This is not an economy is going to boom into an inflationary crisis. It's too bifurcated. Mike just asked, is this modern monetary theory? No, it's not. And I'm not one of those. But if you ever want to talk about that, well, yeah, fine. Right. It's not MMT. It's just based, honestly, you don't need to do MMT. We do all this with the bond market, right? It's very straightforward. There's nothing fancy about this. You don't have to unify balance sheets or any of that sort of stuff. We're effectively doing it because of COVID.
So Mike had another very good question, which is, what about some more radical redistributive proposal, right? If the problem is the wealthy old and the poor young, why not have something like 100% estate tax? How basically sort of dissipate the wealth of the old and put it back into the economy?
So when we wrote the book and we were thinking about the things that we wanted to put in the back that are things you could do, we had one criteria. And the criteria is, well, actually 3 criteria wrapped into one. Is it clear? Is it a clear policy, right? Can people actually understand what this is and why it's meant to do? And an estate tax definitely ticks this, right? Is it something that's going to get support on the left and the right simultaneously? That's where that one gets into trouble. Number 3, is it something that could be easily weaponized and delegitimated? That's the death tax, right? So the problem with this is, as we know with the estate tax debacle of 10 years ago, I mean, this thing affects, what is it? 0.5% of the US population, and yet they managed to sell it as a death tax that basically everyone's going to suffer from. That's the type of politics that's really hard to overcome. So while I think that that is a good technical solution, I don't think it works politically. I think we have to be smarter and think about putting things in the room that no one can object to, and then building out from there.
So speaking of the wealthy old, what about sort of, anti-elite sentiment, right? Deirdre asked a question about elite education, but I think we can ask this more broadly. One of the defining features of populism is this profound disgust with the status quo elites. Where does that fit into Angrynomics?
We were quite clear about it in the book. We think that what happened was that the animating ideologies of the kind of capitalism 2.0 period basically fell apart at the end of the Cold War. And what we were replaced with, if you think about the sort of the Schroeder, Blair, centrist consensus of politics, Clinton gets thrown into this as well, is a kind of market liberal, capital friendly, don't worry about it, everything will be okay, technocratic centrism, whereby politics was evacuated and everything became a policy. Social movements are irrelevant. Why would you join a political party? You can express yourself through the internet, right? That sort of stuff. And on the sidelines, we were as a class the people who cheered this on. We were as a class the people who massively benefited from this. So the people who didn't benefit from this, I think, are absolutely right to point to those pointy-headed academics and those elitists on the coast that ran off with all the cash, because ultimately we did, right? If you want a very simple way to think about this, our universities cost more per year than 70% of Americans earn in a year. And somehow we can keep that system going. Well, that does say disconnected elite in a way that nothing else does.
And yet many of the supporters of the populists are themselves, if not the elite, then a step right below it, right? These are, a lot of them are upper middle class voters. They're not,
absolutely.
They're not the ones who are the very poor. And that brings us to several questions about the politics of Angrynomics. The first of this is, so how do you convince the voters to adopt these policies?
Again, it's a slim book and we don't have all the answers. How do you convince them to do this? You convince them. So I'll give you an example of the Citizens Wealth Fund, right? So we've had conversations with people in British politics, etc., and a few other places up in Scotland as well. And what happens is you explain this to even right-wing politicians and they go, so let me get this straight. This expands ownership. It basically gives capitalism a kind of insurance policy. It gives ordinary people buy-in and gives them an endowment over time, which actually is wealth accruing, and none of it's based on taxes. Right, I'm in, that's brilliant. Then they go to the Treasury officials, and the Treasury officials go, oh no, right? So Anant will get this one. The number one, the joke about banking is, the first rule of banking is never give money to anyone who needs it, right? The first rule of public finance in the Treasury is don't spend any money ever if you can at all help it. So there's a kind of problem of mindset, a bureaucratic mindset, which really mitigates against these solutions. I think it's less about getting them into politics and getting them into public imagination. I mean, for example, Andrew Yang, right? UBI, right? He actually got that into public imagination. That's something that we talk about now. Increasingly, citizens' wealth funds are, at least in some circles, becoming something that people talk about. It's getting it into policy. It's like when we went and gave a talk at the OECD, that's where you get the skepticism, is in the technocratic class, right? That's where the real resistance lies.
Yeah, but your answers, I think there's sort of two questions here, right? One is that the answer you just gave is very elite base. It's not about building popular support for these initiatives. And secondly, I'm trying to imagine a Republican Party in the United States, the likes of Mitch McConnell or Ted Cruz, who would actually willfully say that it's time to redistribute and give to the unquote undeserving poor. Can you imagine? I mean, again, it's the popular level.
Well, I mean, some of them, like Josh Hawley and others, actually have, tried to effectively align themselves with the American working class on the grounds that, if you think about the last election, the Democrats barely won it. And they barely won it in a handful of states with, 100,000 votes here or there. And essentially they built a coalition that was urban, suburban, educated, minority, etc. Everybody except the American working class, right? That's who was not in that coalition, right? So they, in a sense, have nowhere to go. And what's happening is the Republican Party's figured out that its old agenda of just giving whatever corporations want to corporations is a busted flush in terms of voters, and that populism sells. And the way that you do this is by basically responding. I didn't say solving, I said responding to working class concerns. And that's exactly what Ted Cruz and these people are going to do. So they may become a crappy party of the working class, but they're absolutely on course to being a party of the working class.
And that sort of leads to another question that came up from Cole, which is, so has this current crisis generated enough constructive anger to sort of build us and sort of to move us to these proposals, to capitalism 4.0?
I hope so. The interesting thing is not just this kind of, let me put this in a European context. Where's a good example of this? Let's think about Germany for a second, right? So the SPD is dead in the water and devoid of ideas. They're stuck below 20%. So they're not going to be carrying any water. So who is carrying water on that? And the AFD is down to 10%. They seem to be basically stuck at that level as well. it's interesting that across Europe, a lot of the action is with the Greens, right? So what is exactly the thing that young people care about? Yes, they care about inequality. Yes, they care about assets, but they also care about having a planet to live on. And there's a lot of action in those parties, even in the more centrist and right-wing elements of those parties, which you do find in Germany, in terms of being open to very innovative and very far-reaching policy solutions that address these concerns through addressing the need for a circular or green economy. And I think that that's where you really begin to see, the action there. But yeah, I mean, I think that, that's where you see it. Sorry, I've lost the thread. What was the original question again?
It was about whether we can channel the public anger and move towards 4.0, right?
Oh, right, exactly, yeah. So that's one way in which it does, which is doing it. I mean, I hate to be totally harsh on this one, but there is the old analogy of society evolving one funeral at a time. So, as those boomers eventually go and they have to bequeath their assets, then they're going to do it to a generation who's, if you look at the long-term public opinion data, really seem to be different. In the sense that usually what we model, and you know this from the work that you've done, right? It's usually a kind of a cohort, it's usually a life cycle effect, right? The old Winston Churchill thing about you're a lefty when you're 20, you get assets, you're a conservative when you're 50, right? That's not so clear with millennials and people younger. And the people younger obviously haven't got there yet, but there does seem to be a cohort effect on certain issues, right? They're not going to become more racist. They're not going to become anti-green, right? There seems to be something qualitatively different in that. So I think that things are trending in a hopeful direction. The third thing is, it's not fashionable to like technological fixes for green stuff, but I do. And I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that's in the pipeline and is coming out of the pipeline, which is really transformative. And the fact that, Germany went on the Die-Energiewende and everybody got very excited about it, and it turned out to be a bit of a busted flush. The Brits have effectively decarbonized about 40% of their electricity production. They now regularly don't use coal at all, like for a week on end. And they're just going to do more and more of this. And as the price of these technologies continue to fall, we'll move beyond the sort of 1.0 of lithium batteries into other things, etc. And I think that generation which is coming up really sort of like is already mentally in that world. They're not in our world. And I think that that's really sort of something that's going to be hugely transformative.
Right. The question is to last out the next 2 decades, right? Well,
that's it. I mean, so Biden, the Biden administration now is sort of, the whole world's taking a collective sigh of relief, right? Like, right, maybe I can put my evacuation plan B on hold for another 4 years. And there's a real opportunity, and I think there is actually a desire to grasp some of these nettles that the Democrats have avoided for the past 15 to 20 years. And if they're able to do this, particularly if they're able to put a massive jobs component and wage component into red states in decarbonization efforts, you might be able to basically really start to form a new coalition with the American working class. And if you do that, that would be very politically stabilizing, right? So there's everything to risk and everything to gain if they do that. If they don't do that, if they basically ignore that constituency and allow them to become kind of rump Republicans and an excuse for more racist populism, then that's not good, right? That's when the trouble really starts. So I think the next 4 years are going to be very interesting in terms of which path we're going to end up taking.
So speaking of new paths, there are 2 questions here about this new sort of capitalism, right? One is, is it possible to have a form of capitalism that doesn't rely on exponential growth? And the second one is about the 80-20 rule, right? The famous rule that 20% produces 80%, 20% of the effort produces 80% of the outcome.
Yeah.
How do those apply?
So you do see Pareto inequalities everywhere. It's absolutely true. They get the 80-20, 80-20 of this, etc. Is it a natural tendency? Well, if it is, it doesn't matter, because ultimately that's why we have government. We can basically stop it happening. That's why you have institutions that redistribute, et cetera, et cetera. So, in a sense, it may be there, then it's something to build on rather than anything else. Sorry, what was the second one again?
It was about exponential growth.
Right, exponential growth. Yeah, I've been reading some really interesting stuff on this. I was originally very, very skeptical of all this kind of donut economics malarkey, right? Because ultimately what it suggests is you've got to basically take the 2 billion people who have absolutely nothing and bring them up to like the minimum OECD requirement, which unless you invent 2 other Earths, means that you basically have to take the OECD median, which is 14, and take it down to 7K. I just don't see everybody in the OECD going, you're all right, have half my income, right? It's not gonna happen, right? But where I'm less skeptical is at the more micro level, and this is the stuff on the circular economy and thinking about waste. There's an amazing thing about industrial processes and most of what we do is it's all linear process where there's a huge amount of waste. And a good example of this is mining. We've now got to the point with mining where the big hole in the ground that they dig results in a huge pile of dirt outside. There's actually now more stuff in the dirt outside than there is in the hole in some of these cases, right? So suddenly it becomes much, much more reasonable to basically not just recycle, to basically use waste as an input and try and get to kind of a closed system. And if you get to a closed system, you actually can do more with less, right? You don't have to always have this focus on growth. And I'm not a degrowth person, right? I still recognize that growth is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you know, as more people appear or more people die, your economy shrinks and these problems get worse. But in a sense, you know, the waste thing is super fascinating because so much of value is treated as waste. And, you know, think about things like farming and fertilizers. If you don't want to use carbon anymore to make this stuff, where are you going to get it from? Well, back in the day when we were designing sewer systems, there was a German chemist who said, you know what, we could basically just clean up our poop. And we decided not to do that. We decided to treat it and throw it out into the sea. But we could go back to that, right? I mean, there's so much stuff that we regard as waste, which could actually be put in a more circular kind of use. Biomaterials, biomimicry, there's some really interesting work being done on this stuff as well. Natural bonds tend to be very easy to break. The stuff that we make tends to be very, very hard to break down. If we engineered our building materials so that they had weaker bonds, not only could you recycle them more, you could actually just repurpose them at source. So you don't need to make stuff all the time. So we just have to, a lot of it is changing the kind of the engineering mindset as much as anything else.
So we're running out of time. There's one final sort of set of questions that came up, which is about ideologies such as, you know, extreme nationalism or the kind of widespread populism we see, and the extent to which they're actually not just the effects of Angrynomics, but they're also its causes, right? So can we endogenize the Angrynomics to politics, not just to...
Yeah, absolutely. I exogenize it, and that's absolutely right. And I think you do need to endogenize because even if it is an effect, over time it gets built in and becomes its own cause, right? So it has to be dealt with on its own terms. Look, at the end of the day, we kind of have to do something that the liberal technocracy that we have built and grown up with is very, very bad at doing, which is to have a statement of purpose. And if you go back to when Europe tried to have a constitution, you see the disaster that was some 20 years ago. But we kind of really need to go back and do this again because you kind of need to know what you stand for. And if basically you recognize that white supremacy and paramilitary movements and all that sort of stuff, it's not just not okay, it is a mortal threat to democracy and is therefore absolutely antithetical to the society that we want to see and raise our children in, then we should say that and make that stand and then be consistent about that. And that would allow us to exogenize that once again, right? Which would probably be the best thing for everyone concerned. But to do that, it takes an act of courage to actually say, no, we are not that, and to say it as a society. And that's a project of politics. That's not a project of policy.
Exactly. Well, on that very political and very hopeful note, Mark, thank you so much for the fantastic discussion and the wonderful presentation. Everyone, thank you very much for coming, and we hope to see you soon at our next event, which will be a book talk by Tim Houghton and Kevin Deegan-Krause on their book on party politics. So with that, thank you very much, and we hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.